This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Professor Noah Pickus will be taking your questions. He's talking about breaking the immigration stalemate. Professor Pickus just completed a report, along with colleagues from the Brookings Institute and Boston College, with recommendations on how to approach potential new immigration legislation. Here at Duke, Professor Pickus is the Narol O. Cohan Director of the university's Kenan Institute for Ethics. He's also an Associate Research Professor of Public Policy Studies. He co-directs the Brookings Duke Immigration Policy Roundtable and is the author of True Faith and Allegiance, Immigration and American Civic Nationalism. Everyone watching is invited to participate in this conversation. To do that, post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or email live@duke.edu. Professor Pickus, we're at your office hours, and before jumping into this report that you've got, we've got the news of the day here, and we already have an email question in, and it comes from David, and he says, do you think President Obama's winning of the Nobel Peace Prize will have any impact on the immigration debate?
I don't think the Peace Prize will move the debate one way or another. I think it will reinforce the existing lines that exist and not shift it one bit.
Now, when we talk about debates in Washington, it's hard to ignore one going on right now, the healthcare reform debate. So when you talk about immigration, is Congress and the country ready to debate immigration reform?
Well, I think a lot of people are waiting to debate it. I don't think anyone's ready for it right now. In fact, healthcare, as you know, is taking up almost all the air in the room. Immigration keeps intruding on the process. You saw that maybe most notably when Representative Wilson famously called out "you lie" to the president during his speech, because what he was calling out there referred to whether or not illegal aliens were covered under the proposed health care legislation. I think right now it's less are we ready to debate immigration than how will the debate over health care affect the immigration debate when it comes. And the challenge right now is that the trust in the country over health care and our ability to actually make reforms there is eroding steadily. And to the degree to which we don't do something useful there, which most Americans can get behind, it's going to be harder, I think, to do something useful on immigration.
So let's dive into this report that you've just released along with your colleagues, William Galston and Peter Scarry. It's called Breaking the Immigration Stalemate, From Deep Disagreements to Constructive Proposals. The Washington Post covered it, and their headline read, U.S. should give preference to skilled immigrants over relatives. Did they get it right? Is that a good summary of this report?
Well, that's one of the recommendations we make, and it's an important one that we should talk about. We tried to get at a series of policies that really, when you put them together, create an overall architecture for immigration reform. Part of the problem with any headline in that sense is that it pulls out one particular recommendation, and we brought together people who had significantly different views and asked them what could they spend a year doing that would actually put together a building we could all be proud of creating, so that the question of family immigration and skilled immigration is a key part of that, which is sometimes left out when the focus is only on illegal immigration, but it's certainly only one piece of the larger puzzle.
So what's that larger puzzle? How do you round out what this report is recommending?
Well, the report, the recommendations that we made tried to look at several areas that we think are key. One is the question of illegal immigration, and we make recommendations there with regard to both significant workplace enforcement and how that might link to a legalization program in a way that both sides of the debate might be able to get behind. So we tried to get to yes, given our disagreement on illegal immigration. But we put that in the context of a legal admissions system that is both the mix, which we tilt more towards skilled than extended family, though we maintain a strong support for the nuclear family in immigration, and in terms of a temporary worker system that needs to be vastly improved, and looking toward the future so that we don't every 20 years simply have another debate over immigration that we've ignored for that period, but we set up a system and we make recommendations for a commission that would be helpful in this regard to make it more possible for Congress to deal with this in an ongoing and flexible way rather than an up and down every 20 years.
Professor Pickus, you say that in producing this report, the process for creating it is about as important as the actual conclusions. Now, why is that?
Well, it's no secret that bipartisanship is difficult to come by nowadays, and you only have to look at the healthcare debate, where they're both reasoned and principled positions on different sides of the issue, but it's difficult for those proponents of those positions to even talk to each other in the shout fest that goes on cable TV and in Washington. And we wanted to take people who genuinely disagreed, not the entire spectrum of the country, but significant disagreement, and see what would happen if we got people to work together across a year where they recognized that there were reasonable positions on the other side and that some compromises had to be effected, not backroom compromises, but transparent compromises about what we were going to trade off in order to achieve our goals. And what happened in that process, I think, was that individuals with significantly different perspectives were able to recognize that we needed to significantly improve on the status quo, and that meant nobody was really happy. No member of our group was happy with the final report in every single recommendation. But all of them could see that it was on balance a much better approach, and that's what took a year's worth of work to actually accomplish.
Professor Pickus, we have about 60 people here participating in your office hours, and everyone is invited to join in by Facebook, by Twitter, or by email. We have a question here by email that comes from Brian, and here it comes. He says, "Why do you use the term immigration when referring to people who are in the United States illegally? If I decided to move onto your property tonight and start using your bathroom facilities, would you label me as some form of intruder, or would I just be an immigrant? People are going to have areas where they disagree on handling such issues, but when the debate is poisoned by not calling a spade, you cannot have a serious discussion." And there's a question. Here's the question. "So is your discussion about immigration policy or how to deal with existing and potential intruders who circumvent the policy?"
That's a fair and a serious question, and we took it seriously. We looked at both illegal and legal immigration. They are both migrants one way or another, whether you wish to call illegal immigrants undocumented workers or illegal aliens or intruders. I think that we took the position that we could argue all the time we wanted about the different terms that you could use. Undocumented suggests that it's merely somebody here without papers. Illegal suggests that the most important thing is the illegality. And we wanted to focus on not that brawl, but actually on the policies that could deal with the issue. Having said that, I guess it's not the caller, the emailer's question is a serious one. And it's interesting to note that Senator Schumer, now the leading Democrat instead of Senator Kennedy on Capitol Hill for immigration reform, has said quite clearly that he believes it's important not to say intruder, but to call a spade in the sense of illegal immigration, and not to obfuscate with different terms. What he's trying to get at there, I think, is both truth about the terminology, but also an understanding, and this ran through our group and it runs through the entire country, that when you have to ask the question, the fact that someone is here illegally, they have violated the law. On the other hand, there's a lot that we've done in this country, intentionally and otherwise, to encourage people to come here, to look the other way, to benefit from their presence. And simply to hold those who have crossed the border illegal responsible solely leaves out the rest of the story. And I think that's what we're trying to get at, is the whole story, not only one angle at it.
Professor Pickus, you're obviously invested in this debate professionally, but immigration is something that can often touch people personally in some way. Do you have a personal connection in this debate?
Well, I think almost all of us in this country, certainly most of us, have a personal connection in one way or another. Many are getting new connections just by the changing demographics in their community, what happens with their kids in the schools, and the positives and negatives that they're encountering there. But my own experience goes back to my grandfather on my mother's side, who came here over 100 years ago, got off the boat in Galveston, Texas, ended up on a train sent to Kansas City, where when he got off was taken in by the Pendergast machine, a corrupt political machine at the time that got him into the voting booth, and some 5 or 10 years later saw fit to make him a citizen, which is, of course, not the textbook civics way we imagine things happening. And I think it's a story that was both how my grandfather and my family got incorporated into this country in this organic, often messy way, and a story that makes us recognize there aren't always straight lines we can draw on immigration. It goes through families, it goes through complicated histories, and we need to acknowledge that. My favorite cartoon on this is always the one from the New Yorker about the two pilgrims getting off the boat, and one says to the other that in the short run I'm here for religious freedom, but in the long run I'm here for looking into real estate. And I think that captures some of the messiness of the motivation and the complexity of immigration, which touches on so much of our lives here in America, and that's compelling enough for me at any moment.
Professor Pickus, we have another question coming by email, and everyone watching is invited to jump into the conversation with a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, by tweeting with the tag Duke Live, or dropping a good old-fashioned email to live@duke.edu. This question does come by email from Linda, and she says, there has been an incredible sputter concerning a huge financial drain from the pockets of U.S. workers and taxpayers to the pockets of illegal immigrants via Medicaid, loss of jobs, and an inability of the U.S. to tax wages. Have there been any reliable statistics released which would indicate whether the economy is truly being damaged?
Well, when you wade into the economic aspects of illegal immigration, it does get murky quickly. It's very clear that there are many positive effects of immigration in general and of illegal immigration on the economy. There's no doubt that it has contributed in many ways to cheaper lettuce in the stores and to improvements in communities and to overall growth in the economy. At the same time, there have been negative effects. And what's important here to pay attention to in particular is the negative distributional effects. That is, to the extent to which illegal immigration often competes. For instance, illegal immigrants can compete with other low-wage workers, citizens and permanent residents, often who have dropped out of high school or have only completed high school and not gone on. There they often feel the bite more. Or competition with African Americans in different communities, where it's one thing to say there's overall growth in the economy, it's another thing to say how this affects us on a per capita basis or how this affects individuals who are differentially situated. So if you're a lawyer or a professor or an accountant or any number of people at the higher end or even the middle of the scale, wage scale, immigration and illegal immigration often benefits you. But if you're at the lower end of the wage scale, there's more direct competition. And the question there is not simply what's the balance, but how do we judge what the effect is on, how do we pay attention to, or who do we pay attention to, where the effect matters most.
In talking about money and economics, your report focuses on the workplace as a key area for implementing any new policies. Why this focus on the workplace?
Well, the focus there is plain, that there's been a lot of attention to border security, and I certainly believe that border security is important and there's more we can and should be doing, but it doesn't get at the question of why people are coming here. They're coming here because there are jobs, and we have let employers off the hook because there isn't a serious way in which they can actually, even when they want to, enforce the law. We don't have a policy that is more than a charade right now on that. And we believe that there are now opportunities through programs like E-Verify that are growing that make it possible to actually enforce the laws we have on the books at the workplace in a way that would reduce the pull of jobs. That is, the pull up for immigrants to come here illegally for those jobs. And what we try and do in our report is recognize that there are strong proponents for a legalization of illegal immigrants and strong proponents of an enforcement-first approach. Let's do enforcement and then see what happens. Maybe everyone will go home. We went through those issues in our roundtable group for over a year, and there were principled positions on both sides of why we needed to do legalization and why we needed to do enforcement. In the end, what we tried to come up with the recognition was that there were problems with each position moving forward on its own, and that there are ways to link them together that give incentives for legalization advocates to support greater workplace verification, and those who want to see workplace verification scaled up significantly in as short a time as possible to be willing to abide by a legalization program if these were tied together. And that's part of the recommendations that we're trying to advance to suggest how the country might get through this issue.
Professor Pickus, we have another question here. It comes by email from Leslie. And she writes, because of the angst and politicalization of the comprehensive immigration reform topic in the Senate, do you think passing piecemeal reform would be beneficial given that the whole of the topic has been obviously overwhelming to our policymakers, thus no change, no progress?
Well, you're absolutely right, Leslie, about the problem that doing this comprehensively has caused. It just, in some ways, it's like the healthcare debate. It becomes too big, and it's hard for people to manage. At the same time, I'd say the only thing worse than trying to do it comprehensively is to do it piecemeal, partly because the pieces all relate to each other, and partly because the lack of trust is so deep on these issues. If you think healthcare, there's a lack of trust, immigration is even worse. And because it's so deep, that when you try and do one issue at a time, you're really fighting the bigger battle every time through that issue, and that's a very ineffective way of going about it. Now, the last time around in 06 and 07 that the country tried to pass comprehensive immigration reform, I think there was a good faith effort there to figure out a way to do this. The problem in my mind was not that it was comprehensive, it was in some sense that it was simultaneously not comprehensive enough and not specific enough. That is to say, it didn't deal with legal admissions. It didn't deal with the overall numbers of immigrants. It didn't deal with how we were going to manage this into the future. It didn't deal with the question on many people's minds of assimilation and integration. So all that was left out. And then at the same time, it emphasized important ideas like enforcement and legalization, but didn't really connect them in a way that many Americans felt was believable, that we were going to get both. And that really sunk it in the end. So I think it's important to have a comprehensive approach, even more comprehensive than before, but also to be transparent on the ways in which the pieces fit together, because those are the trade-offs that we're talking about. In verification and for employment and border security, legalization, family and skilled immigration, overall numbers, ways to deal with this transparently, questions of integration and relations with Mexico, that you just can't separate them out, I believe.
Professor Pickus, you're referencing previous immigration debates, and we may remember words like amnesty, guest worker, border security. These are not words that appear prominently in the report that you've just released with your colleagues. Why not?
Well, it really connects to what I was saying a minute ago. We think that the comprehensive reform legislation had much to offer from it, but where we really started was on the assumption that once the 07 legislation had failed, if we simply waited a few years and picked up again from where it started, all of the flaws that were built into it were simply going to stay with us. And what we're trying to do in this report is not lay out every single policy that ought to be dealt with, but to provide a high-level roadmap that can reset the debate in a broader way, in many cases, in other ways, in a more tangible and specific way. So, for instance, we do talk about legalization, which amnesty, legalization, earned legalization, they're all the different terms the different advocates used. We talk about that, but we connect it to the enforcement dimension of things, not simply at the border, but particularly at the workplace, as an absolute centerpiece that needs to be moved to the core of the debate, not on the periphery. And on guest worker programs, we took a long and hard look at that. And our belief there is that it is very hard to figure out why you want to, what is the optimum level of immigration. It's an arbitrary number to some degree. And proponents of guest worker programs certainly had much in their favor. Businesses have needs they're trying to meet. They can't hire at different times, even if they're workers elsewhere in the country or sometimes in their community. And they're trying to meet these, and they're very good workers that are available to them that wouldn't be there if we have significant enforcement efforts. At the same time, that is a way of simply going not simply to a need of an employer, but a demand. I mean, an employer need is, this is what I need at this wage with these benefits in this situation with this time. And what an employer says he or she needs may not be the same thing as what the country as an overall needs. So what we tried to do is make some recommendations on ways to improve a temporary worker program in the short run. But we recommend, as some others have, a standing commission on immigration be set up so that every 2 years recommendations could go to Congress, that Congress could adopt, amend, or reject entirely, but would build both more flexibility into the numbers of immigrants coming, the mix of skilled and unskilled, so that it wouldn't be this every 20-year debate. It would be every 2 years we could adjust the numbers. And it wouldn't simply be a technocratic kind of commission. It would also be one that could look at all the different kinds of effects of immigration on the country and set a broader agenda and increase the public debate so more trust was had in what was happening from the government perspective rather than disappearing behind closed doors. We think that's a better way of taking seriously the demands of employers, but also of paying attention to the overall distributional effects and the needs of the country.
We've got 50 people watching here this office hours, and everyone is invited to jump into the conversation by Facebook, by Twitter, or by email. Professor Pickus, if we could bring the conversation from Washington, D.C. to right here at Duke University, where you're the director of an ethics institute. So how do you make this connection between immigration and ethics?
Well, I made one connection before we started this process, and then another after we've gone through it. I mean, the initial connection is easy. I think there are deeply ethical questions wrapped up in the issue of how many people you let into a country, what standards you use to determine who gets to come in, whether or not who becomes a citizen, what citizenship is made up of, who we are as a nation. Those are all fundamental questions of ethics, how you resolve that. If you resolve it on economic grounds, on humanitarian grounds, or on other grounds, are ethical questions, and we wanted to make sure that those were at the center of these kinds of considerations, that it's not just a practical kind of debate. At the same time, I can tell you that we began this process with the 20 members of the roundtable who all came from different backgrounds and perspectives, and we began by highlighting the values at stake and the principles involved, and we talked about them a lot. And while it was very engaging as a university seminar, the truth was we discovered that we were too far apart to get meaningful agreement if we started from those principles. And so what we ended up with is what's sometimes referred to in the universities, referring to the philosopher John Rawls as an overlapping consensus, which is to say, once we began to focus on the practical recommendations that people in the group were willing to live with, not always delighted by, but willing to live with, that they could actually find significant agreement and build trust on the linkage of those recommendations, as long as they didn't have to have a deep discussion about what principle led to that exact recommendation. There was an overlap of their principles and their interests and considerations that resulted in the package we put together. And that's an interesting lesson, that ethics is not simply the application of abstract philosophical principles that tell you exactly what you want. Even if you think that's the way to proceed, it's not a very good way to operate in a democracy where you have to deliberate over these differences.
We've got another question here by email to Talk Politics, and the question is, I've been listening for the past 20 minutes to you discussing immigration in terms of rational public policy, but I'm tempted to ask, who are you kidding? Politicians and others have shown a limitless ability to start rabble-rousing and fear-mongering on this issue. Do you really think it will be decided on the basis of good policy?
Well, I don't know that it will be decided on the basis of good policy, but I think good policy that attends to the genuine and serious concerns of a range of Americans can make a difference. I actually think the issue is less the rabble-rousing of politicians. I think they're caught in difficult pincer situations. So you have, on the one hand, the demands made by businesses, as I said, often legitimate, but not necessarily the ones we should always respond to. So often, immigration policy for years was made in quiet rooms and clientelist relations between agriculture and other employers and politicians. That continues, and it is quite appropriate, but it's no longer the only game in town. You also have a very roused public, often on a more restrictive side of things. When Lou Dobbs or Glenn Beck get angry about this, they can flood congressional offices with calls that make it very difficult for senators and congressmen to do anything. And then you have advocacy groups. In this case, I'd mention advocacy groups who believe very much that the president was elected with the mandate to do immigration reform, that Hispanics are counting on that, and it's a high priority. And in those three dimensions, the demands of employers, the advocacy groups, and the restrictionist general public, you have politicians, I think, looking for ways forward that are new and could, not new as in completely different, but could open up possibilities that they address the concerns of different sides and actually get somewhere. So I don't think it's that rational policies are the answer, but I think policies that have a good ear for listening to what different concerns are. And at a certain stage, like healthcare, like any of these debates, it's a statement to our politicians and to we as Americans, are we adults? Adults are people who make choices between less good trade-offs. They're not our perfect policies. But anyone who thinks we just want to stay with the situation right now, I think that's not the way to go, and we need to offer good policies that address real concerns, and that's something politicians might be able to work with.
In talking about immigrations outside of policy, there is the issue of how do you implement and enforce existing laws. There's the approach of raiding and arresting immigrants, illegal immigrants, and then there's the approach of coming into a workplace and threatening legal action so that the employer gets the pressure and is pushed to fire illegal immigrants. What about these different approaches to enforcing existing laws as a way to hint at immigration policy?
Sure. I think the current administration is in a difficult situation. On the one hand, they are adopting some new techniques. Often I think these are very smart techniques for how to enforce existing laws. And that's important because simply doing workplace raids, while it keeps a focus, it makes people alert, it also has a significant, awful and terrible effect on communities that I think we ought to care about. We're not simply enforcing the law, we're also dealing with real human lives here, and we ought to pay attention to both. And I think the Obama administration has shown some real intelligence on how to move forward on this. And I think that's part of their understanding that in order for them to move to some of their stated goals, like a legalization program, that they have to show they're serious about enforcement. The difficulty is that they're caught between, if they do even what they're doing right now, they get significant criticism from immigrant advocates that it's too much, and they get significant criticism from those who want to see less restriction, more restrictionist policies or lower immigration. that it's just not half as much as what you need. And so it's a very delicate position to be in, that they're trying to set things up for a broader package, but it's hard to do that. As I said earlier, you need to lay the groundwork, but doing any one piece at a time doesn't really require other people to come to the table and say, what are they willing to compromise on?
Viewers are invited to jump into this conversation by Facebook, by Twitter, or by email. Professor Pickus, in slicing this immigration issue, your report deals mostly with approaches to national immigration legislation, but what about how this issue plays out locally in city councils and sheriff's departments? How is immigration being debated there?
Sure. Well, part of what we're seeing is that in the absence of serious federal action to deal with immigration policy, most of the issues and the tensions and the debates are felt most powerfully at the local level. Here in North Carolina, you can see this in community colleges, not just in North Carolina. These are debates in many localities, in issues of zoning and residency laws, in questions of the local police cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies. And it's a very, very strange situation that there in many ways is no good answer to, because the answers are often at the federal level. And you see, for instance, in North Carolina, we've seen a movement back and forth in the last year or so in our community colleges over whether to admit undocumented immigrants to community colleges. And there was, I forget the exact timing, but the answer was we did, and then the policy was we didn't, and then there was a question of if we did. And just most recently, the policy is to allow illegal immigrants to come to community colleges, but to pay out-of-state tuition. And this is, I think, an example that captures just how difficult it is at the local level. Because on the one hand, that's a Solomon-like decision. It says we have immigrants here, they're contributing, they're growing up here, their kids are here, they're part of the community, we've drawn them here. We shouldn't deny them this part of our educational and economic and civic future. On the other hand, if you simply provide for illegal immigrants access to every possibility and every benefit, not that they get access to all benefits, but if you increase that, then you are reinforcing the notion that illegality doesn't matter. And so the community college decision in this case suggests, well, we need to meet the first concern by allowing illegal immigrants to be in our community colleges, but meet the second concern by charging them out-of-state tuition and not treating them as if they're simply the same as North Carolina legal residents. So as I say, on the one hand, it's Solomonic, and on the other hand, the practical result is that very few illegal immigrants are going to pay the thousands of dollars tuition that it takes to be an out-of-state resident in our community colleges. And so it doesn't really solve anything. And I'm not blaming the policymakers here. I think they're caught in a very much a no-win situation. And we have two ways forward. One is to fix the federal legislation in the ways that our roundtable tries to get at. And the other is to think creatively about, if we're really going to be stuck with this in the long term, which of those both-and Solomon-like decisions can we live with in different areas rather than giving in completely to one position or the other.
Professor Pickus, we have an email here from CJ who asked if in preparing the report were any immigrants involved in the roundtable, and more broadly, what role do immigrant communities play in affecting U.S. policy on immigration?
Sure. So this was a report, on the one hand, your typical Washington or East Coast group of academics, policymakers, former government officials, some community organization people. In other words, it was a report by elites. It was not something, we didn't go out and travel the country and consult communities in that sense. It was a broader report in that we brought in people who had significantly different perspectives, including reflecting many immigrant communities, that I think we listened to a wider range than you might think of simply people who have sat on commissions forever and ever. In particular, we had one person I would emphasize, which Juan Rangel, who runs United Neighborhood Organization in Chicago, which amongst other things is the country's largest operator of Hispanic charter schools, and is very much an organization deeply embedded not only with new immigrants but in the community in Chicago and New Orleans and elsewhere, and could bring very much of an on-the-ground perspective to the conversation. You'll have to help me out. There was the second part of the question was about what role do immigrant communities play in these debates? Yes. Well, I think some of them they are organized often by advocacy groups, partly because they share those views, partly because these are things that are very close to their community and to their hearts, and they care a lot about it. And so you certainly see protests when we had the immigration reform legislation in 06 and 07 that were significant. Part of the debate there, as you may remember, was the question of those protests that had a significant number of, in particular, Mexican flags flying, and then it became a strategy to fly American flags, and that gets at some of the politics of it. But you also have immigrant communities that you don't often think about on the more skilled end of the spectrum, who are also very affected and very engaged with these kinds of policy matters. So are immigrant communities involved? Yes. Were they deeply engaged in our deliberations? Not directly, no.
Professor Pickus, we have another question by email on the topic of compromise, and it says, George Bush and John McCain both tried to stand up to the radical right and engage in a serious debate about immigration reform. For the most part, the rest of the Republican Party left them hanging out on a limb. Will that ever change?
Well, I think there are two things there. One is, I think you're right about that. And there was a willingness of the president and Senator McCain to actually try and get somewhere. And the challenge today is maybe even more so than it was 2 years ago, in that it's just not clear to me who the moderate interlocutors are in Congress who could really get this forward. And I mean that both on the Democratic side. I think Senator Schumer has said a number of important things that suggest that he both will carry on Senator Kennedy's legacy, but he will also make some changes. He's very much in favor of making sure there's a secure ID that undergirds any verification program at the workplace. He said we need to use the word illegal and not always hide behind the term undocumented. At the same time, he's going to be a strong proponent of legalization in other positions. And the question is, who are his interlocutors on the other side? I don't know that Senator Kyle and Senator McCain have a strong appetite for dealing with this right now. And there are Democrats who, I don't think you can get 60 Democrats to vote for a straight immigration bill, which means you need some moderate Republicans. And this is a very difficult kind of issue to find. And that's why I think even if a bill is introduced in next year, I think it's going to take some time to work through. And part of our effort, in a small way, was trying to lay the groundwork and suggest that you could take seriously opposition to amnesty. You could consider it a principled position. You could be concerned about the overall number of immigrants that are coming into the country. You could worry about relations with Mexico. That all of those could be are serious, reasonable positions that could be taken and made part of a compromise. I think what happened with Senator McCain and President Bush is they didn't always do that. And in particular, they focused heavily on the guest worker program, which I talked about a little earlier, and which we think has more flaws than benefits to really addressing the needs and the concerns of the American public. So the question is, can we expand the middle on these kinds of issues?
Professor Pickus, before leaving your office hours, we should be sure to turn to your book, True Faith and Allegiance, and you advance this concept of civic nationalism as a way forward for addressing immigration. So what is civic nationalism?
Well, that book and civic nationalism in general was a little bit less about immigration policy and more about what is sometimes called integration or Americanization policy. It's a book about what it's meant over 200 plus years to be and to become an American citizen. And the idea of civic nationalism is simply that some people say all it means to be an American is to agree with certain values, certain principles about individual freedom, constitutionalism, the rule of law. And other people have said, no, over the centuries it's meant that you're actually a white American, or that you are, in some ways, it's a more restricted identity. And I think what we've seen over 200 years is a mix of those, sometimes with extremes on both sides to our detriment, but at our best, we've actually had an understanding that being an American is in the service of core principles, but it's connected to an organic sense of belonging and identity that means that immigrants, we want to identify with our past and our future, that they can be connected to where they've come from. They don't need to lose their ethnic identity, but at the same time there's a strong sense of being Americans. And that this is a way, when we talk about what a naturalization test should look like, or how we integrate immigrants into our community, which is a section of our report. In fact, the section is on assimilation and integration, which is, we use both terms because we're actually trying to advance a kind of civic nationalist idea. Assimilation meaning a sense of belonging and identity and commitment, and integration meaning economic and social and educational inclusion and advancement. And too often in this country we have people who talk about immigrants becoming citizens, and they only focus on the assimilation or the integration side, and we try and again show ways in which those can reasonably be linked. And that's about the future of the American experiment and the American promise that immigrants have always renewed, and I believe can and should and will continue to do so.
Professor Pickus, we've got one more question here by email. It comes from Abby, and she asks, how is immigration reform connected to healthcare reform?
Well, I think there are two ways. In the most specific way it's connected is, as I said earlier, when Joe Wilson called out to the president saying he had lied, it's connected on the question of who is covered by health care benefits. And when the president or others say, and many share this view, that we need to cover all uninsured, does all uninsured mean people who are here present legally and illegally? If you're trying to deal with the problem of people who lack insurance, there's a significant number of illegal immigrants that you would want to address. On the other hand, if you do that, you then get wrapped up in the immigration debate about how to deal with illegal immigration. And so that's part of the issue right there. And then more broadly, I think what it gets at is the deep lack of trust, or the great amount of distrust in the country today over what's actually happening here. What kind of changes are we seeing, and how fundamental are they? And so accusations of death panels in healthcare, I think you'll see accusations, and not only from a conservative perspective, but I think you can see liberal advocates saying if we don't fix some things, then terrible things will happen in our immigrant communities, as if that is the only thing that is happening and we shouldn't do enforcement. And so the lack of trust that Americans on different sides of healthcare and on immigration feel gets in the way of anyone being willing to take a chance and say, this is a way we could actually compromise that doesn't violate every single one of my principles, but neither does it make me happy about this. I'm not going to take my position and have only that perspective. And that's where healthcare may advance and right now may poison the possibilities for genuine immigration reform.
Professor Pickus, thank you for holding these office hours. Any concluding exhortations, either on a policy level as we follow this debate, or just in our personal lives, immigration in our families, in our communities? A final word from your office hours.
Well, I think that a number of the questions today have rightfully been about, this all sounds so rational and reasonable, Professor Pickus, but isn't this all about politics, or isn't this about extremism in one form or another? And I don't want to deny that politics and extremism are alive in our our public discourse today. But I think that what each of us needs to do is not to give up on our core convictions on this, but be willing to understand that there are positions on the other side that are principled and not unreasonable, that there are ways in which we might meet each other on these issues that could produce a better future, because right now I don't think the status quo, while it meets certain interest groups' interests and needs, it doesn't meet what immigrants, legal or illegal, need, and what America and Americans overall need. And so I would ask people to step back and try to demonize a little less while sticking to their core convictions. Not demonizing doesn't mean not saying difficult things. It just means being open about the possibility that there's a way forward on this, which isn't completely an either or. And that's what I think our recommendations have at least pointed the way toward.
The conversation can continue. Post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or email live@duke.edu. Join in the next conversation here on the Duke Ustream channel with Duke Reads. This coming Wednesday at 7 p.m., Duke Provost Peter Lang will be discussing the book House of Cards by alumnus William Cohen. It chronicles the fall of the investment firm Bear Stearns. To learn more about Duke, visit duke.edu.